John Dark.
Good morning, Laurie.
As you know, the ISHLT has instituted a history project to obtain reminiscences and archival footage from people who've had a major impact in the field and in the evolution of the field, as well as on the evolution of the society. And to that end, we're very grateful that you could join us today.
Flattered.
So let's just start then with your background. You're a native of Manchester. You obtained your medical school degree at the University of Newcastle in 1976, and your father was a surgeon.
He was a cardiothoracic surgeon.
So how did that influence your eventual decision to enter a medical pathway?
Going into medicine was straightforward. There's not much else good you can do with the high school qualifications I had. Going into surgery was influenced by my father because he introduced me to some key people. I did a medical elective in Canada, in Toronto in 1974, with Bill Mustard and Bill Bigelow. George Trussler was there, and after that, everything seemed tame compared with cardiothoracic surgery.
So can you tell us a little bit about that elective?
Oh, I had great fun. I was just a third-year medical student. I was treated as a clinical clerk by the people in Toronto. Len Bailey was the senior resident at Sick Kids. He took me under his wing, allowed me to do things that were unthinkable for a third-year student in the UK, and it was a lasting influence.
So that had a major impact obviously on your
Absolutely.
Pathway. You then trained in surgical training in Glasgow and Edinburgh and other
Yeah.
places, and later with both Magdi Yacoub and Donald Ross. What were those days like?
They were tremendous days. I went to Harefield in 1983, and he'd done something like 50 heart transplants. Cyclosporin was available. The operation was becoming routine. The anticipation was that the patient would survive and leave hospital. I got involved in retrieval. The other senior resident did not like flying, so I went off in night in the helicopter. And that was another stimulus to get into transplantation. I loved flying around the country.
But you then continued with lung transplantation, and you went to Toronto for a year, I believe, to work as a research fellow.
Some options came open. My thoracic surgical teacher had spent time in Toronto. He had a call from Joel Cooper, who wanted to start doing double lung transplants and felt that this would require cardiopulmonary bypass. He was working in a thoracic surgical lab, and he wanted a fellow who could put a monkey on bypass. And I fulfilled those criteria. The option came available, and I had the right equipment to take advantage of it. So I spent a year with Joel Cooper and Alec Patterson.
That must have been a tremendously exciting time as lung transplantation was just starting. Tell us what it was.
Yet again, I arrived in Toronto. They'd maybe done numbers 1 and 2. I was there for 3, 4, and 5 of the single lung program. It was just tremendously exciting.
When you arrived, number 3 was done a little while later. To take us into the operating room.
Well, the Toronto group had an incredibly talented team, and they functioned as a team. There was no doubt that Cooper was the chief, but they functioned as a team. So for the implant and the retrieval, the donor was in an adjacent operating room. Most of the thoracic surgeons who were prominent in Toronto were there in the room.
So that would have included who at the time?
Rob Ginsberg, Tom Todd, Alec Patterson, Joel Cooper. They all did the transplant together. I helped Ginsberg do the retrieval.
In the operating theater
in the
next
operating
door.
room adjacent. And then we just watched, and Cooper and Patterson did the implant, but everybody was there, making comments, telling people how to do it. And then to manage the patient, we had one of the senior residents or the fellows from the lab sleep in the room with the patient continuously. We had 8-hour shifts. 3 of us covered the 24 hours, and we stayed with the patient.
For days?
For a week.
For a week. And was this very different to what you had expected?
It was a lot more intense than the way things were managed at Harefield, which was much more laid back, much more laissez-faire. But it demonstrated to me the importance of huge attention to detail.
Right, yes.
Morning and evening rounds, every aspect of the patient's care discussed. Input from immunology, input from hematology, input from renal medicine. An example of how the multidisciplinary team would work long before that term became fashionable.
So a real team approach, a team building, and that was a little bit different then. But it was a new therapy as well, wasn't it?
It was new, but Jakub did things himself. He made all the decisions. He was still is a hugely talented surgeon, hugely talented mind, but he did it all. And Cooper introduced me to how well a team could function, and actually how important a team is.
So when you went back to the UK then, you were first in Edinburgh for a year and a half or so, and then to Newcastle. How did that impact what you developed then as you led the Newcastle program into an incredibly productive few decades?
So I went back as an adult cardiothoracic surgeon to a dream position in Edinburgh, a beautiful city, fabulous colleagues, wonderful setting in which to work. Was very happy there for 18 months. The Newcastle, which was my home university, had started a heart transplant program. In the spring of '87, they did their first single lung, which was certainly the first in the UK and one of the very earliest in Europe. I went down and assisted Chris McGregor, who was the surgeon there, because I was the only guy in the country who'd seen a single lung transplant. Chris then left for the Mayo Clinic, leaving a gap, leaving an established, funded, equipped transplant program, which we were never going to have in Edinburgh. And it was a very tempting opportunity to go there.
So you presumably took some of the lessons from the Toronto experience as you further built this program.
We very much worked as a team. In particular, the pulmonologist there was Paul Corris, an ex-president of this society, and we worked closely together.
And the numbers grew and grew and grew.
It was a good time to grow. There were only 2 other transplant programs in the country, and we were the third, and in due course we became the biggest.
And you also covered pediatrics as well as adult, and both heart and lung.
We are the only program in the UK to cover all of those, and I think it's mutually beneficial.
In addition to building a very active and successful clinical transplant program, you also have continued over the years with an abundant amount of research as well as teaching. How did your research interests evolve, considering where you started in Toronto, perhaps? Did that have an influence on the pathways that you chose to investigate?
What I learnt from my research work in Toronto was that as a surgeon, you have to have collaborators. I've never done an ELISA. I wouldn't know one end of a Western blot from another. I'm not laboratory equipped, not in an analytical basic science sense. So you have to have collaborators, and there were good collaborators in Newcastle. The other thing I learnt was that the laboratory is there to solve the clinical problem. You have a problem in the clinic, you hypothesize a solution, you go to the laboratory to test that solution, you come back into the clinic with the answer to advance the care of your patient.
So this is the very definition of translational research.
And I think for a clinical surgeon, it's what research is all about.
But you yourself have done, perhaps not ELISAs and bench work, but you have a lot of experience in ischemia reperfusion injury and other aspects of things.
In collaboration with basic science,
so
with basic scientists. We developed a pig model of single lung transplantation to look at how we could control reperfusion injury. We then converted that to a rat model. Down the hall was somebody with a rat brainstem death model. Clearly, there's a link between brainstem death and lung injury, and we were able to, in a series of sets of experiments, we were able to define the impact of the brain on the lung in that setting, how you might block that impact, how you might reverse it, how you might minimize it, and we can then carry that through into the clinic.
So bench to bedside and back again, or rather bedside to bench and
That's
back
right.
again,
That's correct.
is the quintessential goal, I think, of translational research.
Yes, I would agree completely.
So when you train new surgeons and you bring them into an academic setting where that is the way to do things, how do you see that evolving over the years? How do you see the impact of changes in training patterns for surgeons and surgeon scientists? What do you think?
My perspective is that from the UK, there was a time when to gain promotion as a junior surgeon, you had to have a period in research. and in a sense it was a box-ticking exercise. But it did give us a generation of trained surgeons who'd been exposed to a research environment. They'd done 1 or 2 years, they gained a higher degree, if not a PhD, and their interrogative analytical faculties were improved by that, even though they may not have stayed in academic life afterwards. It's now frowned upon for surgeons to rotate through an academic environment, with 1 or 2 exceptions. It's much more difficult to be an academic surgeon. I think we like to think it's more difficult than to be an academic physician, because in a craft speciality, you've got to spend time in the operating room to maintain your skills. So my advice to young academic surgeons, and there are a new generation coming through, is that they have to have basic science collaborators. They might learn this year's analyses when they're in the lab, but in 10 years it will be completely different, and they have to collaborate. And they have to be happy to restrict their clinical repertoire.
That's not always easy for a surgeon.
It's impossible, at least to begin with. The newly appointed attending surgeon feels he's wonderful at everything, feels he wants to do as much operating as possible. I operated 3.5 days a week when I was first appointed. But the successful academics are people who are prepared to reduce their repertoire, to focus their clinical interests in particular areas, and leave themselves time for the academic side of their life. And one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that I should have done that when I was young, rather than doing it in my later years.
The new areas that are emerging in lung transplantation, for example, in which a surgeon scientist might find an interesting, intellectually stimulating pathway might be, what do you look at?
Well, our focus has been, we've been focused on the idea that there are not enough organs for our recipients. It's a theme of every transplant center, every transplant meeting you attend. It's a problem for every transplant center. You only need to go and look at the details of the donor organs turned down to appreciate that while some of them are irretrievably damaged, most of them can be restored to good health. And that's what we've been trying to do with the lung. We've been trying to minimize the insult in the donor as much as possible. And more recently, we've been trying to ameliorate that injury before we implant into the recipient with the various ex vivo perfusion technologies. The lung has proved easier to manage in that sense. The gain for the lung is huge. Last year we did 200 lung transplants in the UK. We turned down 500 lungs, principally on function. And function is something that can be improved.
500?
500.
Were turned down.
So there is huge scope to increase our lung transplantivity. And the same applies to the heart. It's a little bit harder with the heart. We used to think the lung was a precious, fragile organ. It's turned out to be remarkably robust
and resilient.
And the other area in the UK we've explored is the use of lungs from DCD donors. 45% of all cadaveric deceased donors in the UK were DCD in 2013.
Yes, it's been an amazing history in the UK.
And the DCD lung is as good and possibly even better as the lung from the brain dead donor.
Why would it be better, do you think?
Well, it hasn't been exposed to the stress of brainstem death, principally. It's exposed to other stresses, particularly during the agonal phase, but it's not been exposed to that catastrophe of brainstem death.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of room to go then.
It's as exciting now as it ever has been.
That's wonderful to hear. You've taken on a new role recently in the UK and are now involved as well in policy and allocation. And can you tell us a bit about that and what the impact is at this stage of your career?
We have essentially a single OPO in the UK. And I've taken a role of troubleshooting. I also have a role in terms of organ utilization for the whole country, which is where that statistic for unused donor lungs comes from. It's the same to a lesser extent for every organ. There are 250 retrieved kidneys which are not implanted in the UK. Some of it's surgical damage, Some of it's anxiety about perfusion, particularly in the DCD kidneys. And there are ways, there are technologies of overcoming that problem.
And so having an impact at the policy level then, based on the new evolutions in the field, is...
I think the field is a rapidly developing one, and we've got the opportunity to significantly increase the benefit of transplantation. Certainly in the UK, where we're a long way behind.
It has been said that the increase in DCD in the UK has resulted in a decrease in the ability to heart transplant.
If you look at there has been a significant increase in the number of donors over the past 5 years. The increase in DBD, brain dead donors, has been almost zero. The age profile of those DBD donors has changed. We are now counting people as donors who were not considered, 75, 85-year-olds who were not considered a decade ago. But the huge increase has been in DCD donation. And probably there are donors who were in a previous era going to become brain stem dead donors, who are now going at an earlier phase in the evolving injury to DCD donation, which is of benefit to the lung, it's okay for the kidney and the liver, it's clearly a huge loss to the heart.
So what's the approach to that?
I don't think we can alter the habits of intensivists. I think we have to respect their decision making and the pressures on their services. But we're exploring the use of the DCD heart.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, we know, everybody says this, that if you go back to the very early days of Barnard and Shumway, the first few heart transplants were from DCD donors. There is ample evidence that if you give the heart the facility to recover from the 10 and 15 minutes of mandatory ischemia that's part of the DCD process, then that heart can potentially function very, 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 very well indeed. In
Canada, there's tremendous amount of ethical unease about considering the fact that a heart could be resuscitated and the definition of death, of cardiac death. I sense that perhaps the dialogue is a little different in the UK. Is it?
There are still difficulties. It's a gradual process. Educating the public that somebody can die of a stopped heart and that heart can go again and yet they remain dead is a challenge. I think to ensure that you resuscitate the heart outside the body is a fundamental part of selling the whole concept. That the heart has stopped, the patient has died because all the other tissues have died.
Right.
You then take it out because it hasn't the heart's not irreversibly died, whereas everything else has, and then resuscitate it, and then assess it.
And that, as part of the key public messages, needs to be managed very carefully.
But I think our interactions suggest that that's a story that we can sell fairly well. I don't think it's going to be an insuperable problem.
I think we'll be looking forward to that dialogue from our side of the pond, certainly, because DCD has not proven very easy to enact in Canada in particular. You served as president of the European Society of Organ Transplantation and subsequently as president of ISHLT in 2010 and 11. When did you first join ISHLT? And tell us the impact that this has had on your career development.
1988 was my first meeting. We were in Los Angeles. I remember it for meeting famous names for the first time and going to Universal Studios, but those are the things that come down over the years. This society is just the very best thing to be part of. It's international, and that's a key part of its value. That local parochial societies don't have the same breadth of experience, the same breadth of exposure. We learn so much more from how other people are doing things in other countries when we come to this society.
So one of the things that ISHLT has taken on more recently in the past few years has been to that very point, that there are parts of the world that we haven't necessarily engaged in tremendous numbers in the ISHLT, and from which we're learning may have different opportunities and different challenges, such as the countries in Latin America or Asia, Eastern Europe,
and the
and so
learning
on.
can go in both directions.
What do you think are the biggest opportunities there? How do you think the ISHLT can effectively...
I think it has to be both ways. I think in many ways people come to us from these countries for learning, but we need to appreciate the local environment in which they function, perhaps different social mores, different ethical frameworks in Latin America, in India, in Japan, and we learn from them. You know, we had a foray in the US and also in the UK in living donor lung transplantation, and we pretty much abandoned it, particularly as lungs become more available. It's been continued in Japan, and how some of those patients are managed and some of the data coming out of those patients is hugely educational in physiological terms for the rest of us. And if it wasn't for the international in the ISHLT, we wouldn't be learning that. It would be presented in a Japanese respiratory meeting.
Yes, that's right.
So I think we need to offer the resource of our learning, but we're not colonizing. We're not telling people how to do things. There is no one single way of managing a transplant program. And I do have some slight anxieties about how didactic some of our guidelines, for instance, can be, that they reflect North America, Europe, Australia, and may not be applicable throughout the world.
Yes, yes. We've also discovered through outreach to Latin America, for example, that scarce donor availability is not necessarily their biggest problem.
Absolutely.
That they, in fact, have abundant donors,
Yes.
or maybe not abundant,
Yes.
but certainly numerous donors that are not used, and that organizational issues may actually be a bigger
Yes.
problem for
Yes.
them.
Yes.
What
Yes, and except I've got links with the programs in Chile, which until recently were entirely done in the private hospitals because it wasn't funded by the government. Now, coming from a liberal North American or North European view, that only the people who can pay get transplants, that seems a little bit difficult to reconcile with how we've practiced, but is the practicality in those countries, and we have to accept that.
What do you think is the most effective way of accomplishing that?
I think an interchange, I think teaching, I think going to these people's meetings and seeing what they're doing and learning as much when you go there as you take with you is very valuable.
One of the things that you introduced during your presidency of the ISHLT was, in fact, this program of visiting scholarships.
I'm very proud of that, and I think we should expand it. I think the people who go on these trips a month at a time to another hospital is costing the society $6,000, and I learned that we have $7 million in the bank today, and is of huge value in opening the eyes of the individuals who go, of facilitating collaborations, clinical and academic, and building links between different centres. One of our nurses in Newcastle has just been in Sydney and Melbourne for a month. And they've learnt things from her. They don't necessarily agree with what she's been trying to tell them, but she will come back with her horizons enormously opened. When we started our rat lung transplant work, we sent a fellow to Stanford for a month to learn a specific technique. And the fact that the society can facilitate that sort of thing, I think is really very useful.
You could say that was informed by your own history, I think.
Well, I think moving around is only ever a good thing.
I agree completely. One of the other legacies from your presidency was the change in the way we organize the annual meeting. That was a major undertaking.
I think that's in some ways the other thing I'm most proud of, that I'd been a program chair, and as you'll know yourself, being a program chair, it informs you of the problems of running the program, running the annual meeting, and the annual meeting is the most important part of all the society's activities. And making it run well and making it the attractive place for everybody in our field to send their work was a particular aim of mine. We used to run the program committee in September, which meant that there was a 6-month gap between acceptance of an abstract and the presentation, 6-7 month gap. And it meant that societies who had their abstract closing dates late in the fall were getting the advantage over us. And we put ours way back. I wanted to put it back into January, but that was going to be too much work. But I think it's made us competitive again. The number of submissions here is a record high. The number of registrants here is a record high, and this, things are continuing to grow.
So, in closing, then, what do you see as the most exciting things, perhaps in the near future and the distant future for the society?
I think our approach is to organ utilization. We've got the same pool of donors. I think, in terms of, from a surgeon's point of view, who doesn't understand stem cells or growing things in Petri dishes, I think we want to flourish because we can get more out of the donor pool that we have, and the opportunities there are huge. And again, we need to learn from each other from around the world to see what they're doing in Canada, Australia, Sweden, other European countries, and the society facilitates that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.